Great. So we are so happy to welcome an amazing, really interesting, amazing, and important insights from Yumi Numata and Kelsey Lee Balaban. They're going to talk about something very interesting behind the Yellowhead Treaty Map. Now, Yumi has a master's degree from NYU in Media Culture and Communications, and she's the director of operations of the Yellowhead Institute here in Toronto. She's focused on how we live and work and the processes we use to engage with each other that are integral for aspects of building a sustainable future. Kelsey has a master's from U of T in political science, is of Métis and Eastern European ancestry from Treaty 6 territory, also with the Yellowhead Institute, with a focus on digital governance, revitalization efforts, youth organization for issues concerning Indigenous people in cities, particularly in harm reduction and urban Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives. And with that, recording didn't end. With that, I'll just switch the slides and feel free to take it away. Just bear with me here. This bar is in the way. I just got to get it. All right. This tab here is the PDF, and that tab there is the map. And we're here. Let us know if you need any help.
Great. It's really nice to be here. This is a different crowd than we're used to. So we're excited to talk about the treaty map. We launched this late last year. It's a project we worked on for over 3 years. And I think every 3 months we were like, we're going to launch it next month. And then, 3 years later, that's how these things happen. But yeah, we're very excited to talk about it. I'll just expand maybe a little bit more on myself just for some context. So as Rock said, I'm the director of operations at Yellowhead Institute, and I'm Chinese and Japanese settler. So I'm not Indigenous. I've worked with Yellowhead since the beginning and when we launched in 2018, and have supported the operational side of things and a lot of the kind of knowledge mobilization and design aspects of the content that we put out. So for this project, I was mostly in charge of overseeing that the website was happening, that all of the folks who are building the map, like liaising with them and connecting them between like them and the researchers and the academic side of things. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. Nice to see everybody online. I'm a little short, so you can see me. And nice to see everyone in person. So I'm Kelsey. I'm, as Brock said, I'm Métis, so Otipem Suisqueo from Alberta, Treaty 6 territory, and Ukrainian settler ancestry too. And I work with Yellowhead as the community engagement specialist, and I've been with Yellowhead for 3 years. My role now, like it has evolved over time. I started as I was a student. Actually, I wasn't, but Yellowhead supported me through my master's. And then I started full time once I graduated. And since then, my role is kind of focused on engaging community. So everything that has to do with our network. And then also because we're such a small team, I'm involved in like a lot of the different research and design a little bit, knowledge mobilization a little bit. So Yumi and I are definitely like, you're getting a good representation of Yellowhead because like we both have our hands in like a lot of it. Yeah, so that's for this project, I was involved with kind of the coordination of all of our collaborators. I contributed some writing and did research, and also like through the many iterations of all of the content we had, because each treaty entry would have so many different levels of edits and iterations to them. So kind of like organizing all of that to the like final production a little bit in collaboration with Yumi and our executive director, Hayden. Yeah, so that's my role.
Just a quick little bit about Yellowhead. We are like a research education center think tank based out of Toronto Metropolitan University. We are Indigenous led, so we have a board of advisors, and our executive director and all of our academic directors are all Indigenous. And the Institute privileges Indigenous philosophy, amplifies Indigenous voices that provide alternatives to settler colonialism in Canada today. We really try to make accessible content, so bridge that gap between kind of academia and community needs. And so we really want to create content that will help communities advocate for themselves and to support Indigenous jurisdiction and the reclamation of Indigenous land and life. And just a quick little thing on who we are. So we have a really small operations team. It's basically 3 people with and an executive director. And then we have 2 additional directors, a research director and an education director. We really center our community collaborators. We have a team of fellows who are Indigenous folks from across the country who lend their advice and support, and we like to amplify their work as well. And we have our board of advisors. So I just highlight this because these are all folks who were also involved in the treaty map, and it's part of kind of our ethos in terms of how we work and how we develop our projects. Kelsey is going to talk a little bit more about treaties and their significance. We already mentioned some in the land acknowledgement, but I think, we all hear those land acknowledgements many times and they kind of maybe lose their meaning sometimes. So
okay, yeah. So getting into like the meat of everything. So I'm sure everybody knows about treaties. The gap that the treaty map that we made fills is Indigenous perspectives on treaties. So as our treaty map explores in a really creative way, I may say, if I may say, treaties aren't new to Indigenous people. We have been making treaties for thousands of years, and it's a diplomatic practice that we're very versed in and aware of. But when we talk about treaties, we often think of the treaties between Europeans and then eventually Canada and Indigenous people and that kind of relationship. But with those treaties, what's often erased is the Indigenous perspectives, as I mentioned. So there's often what gets told is a malinterpreted version of those treaties that amplifies and kind of rewrites the history a little bit to privilege Canada and benefit Canada more, and ultimately contribute to Indigenous dispossession. So the reason that this artwork is by Michelle Sound, who we commissioned to do the artwork for the landing page. And we asked her to do the Royal Proclamation because that's kind of where treaty making in Canada formally started. So the Royal Proclamation is a really interesting document. I don't know, who knows about the Royal Proclamation? Raise your hand. Okay, that makes me feel better. Well, not good, but nobody's going to challenge me too hard. So basically, the Royal Proclamation is this really interesting constitutional source from 1763. And the purpose of it was made to basically attempt to erase Indigenous land ownership by creating a framework for entering treaty. But interestingly, that Royal Proclamation was needed, and it compelled the crown compelled the crown and its subjects that treaties were needed to be entered in order to have access to the land. So it called Indigenous people Indigenous nations, and it recognized that Indigenous people have an inalienable right to the land. So it meant that you can't just go exist on the land. The land actually does belong to Indigenous people, and treaties need to be entered in order for you to have access to the land. So that's what the Royal Proclamation says. So it actually gives us recognition of some of our rights to land. And it basically set out this process for treaty making. It also is like not binding to Indigenous people. It's only binding to the Crown because it is like basically the limitations on them that they have to enter treaties, and that these are like the responsibilities placed upon them. So this means that treaties were entered by a nation-to-nation agreement, so between sovereign nation and sovereign nation. And that means that Indigenous law was actually really important in guiding those negotiations and practices for entering treaty. So when we go back to how I mentioned how like there's one interpretation of treaties, which is the Crown's version, that gets told, and that gets told through a written text. But what happened at the entering of many treaties, especially from my perspective as someone from the prairies, Treaty 6, those treaties were entered with Indigenous protocol and through days of negotiation, through ceremony. So there's this argument that, you know, like you ceded the land because it's written on the written version. But according to Indigenous perspectives, oral histories that recorded these treaties, there's actually like a lot more responsibility and like mutual like reciprocity contained in the treaty beyond just like you signed away rights to the land. So when we tell the Canadian version of treaties, we're actually obscuring the true spirit and intent of treaties that are held in these oral histories and Indigenous perspectives. So that's why like the Indigenous perspective of treaties are so important to be amplified. I could talk more about like the treaty that we're on and like the Toronto Purchase, but I don't want to go on too long, so maybe it'll come up later. But that's kind of why treaties are so important, but more importantly, the Indigenous perspectives that have always been obscured and erased and malinterpreted and are, you know, like not publicly available when you Google them and try to look up the treaty, why those are so important to bring to public awareness.
Thanks, Kelsey. So if you want to visit the treaty map, it's at treatymap.yellowheadinstitute.org. So this is ultimately what we ended up launching a few months ago. This is the homepage, and as you can see here, we have descriptions of, or the treaty map includes the 4 eras of treaty making. So pre-Confederation treaties, Confederation era treaties, modern treaties, and Indigenous treaty making. And if you explore the map a little bit, you'll, or the website a little bit, you'll be able to like hopefully read accessible descriptions of all of these, and then actually search and learn about more of the treaties as you use the map. So I'm just going to click on the map over here. And yeah, so here you can click unselect or select whichever era of treaty that you're interested in, or you could go by like a geographic area and learn more about the description of each of these treaties. As you can see, these descriptions are like relatively short, but Kelsey can probably speak more to the tons and tons and tons of research that went into creating the descriptions for all of these treaties from an Indigenous lens, using Indigenous sources as much as possible. So we had lots of Excel sheets and kind of 5 key questions that our researchers tried to answer. And then it was like multiple rounds of edits to try to boil it down to a succinct version. So of course, there's lots of information that's missing or that's not included, but we try to include the core and the key information. And then we do have in mind a phase 2 of the treaty map where we'll be able to expand on some of this content and perhaps kind of include some more teaching and educational tools connected. But yeah, this is basically the map. And then, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. We have some FAQs on the page as well, and just more areas of information where we talk about our process a little bit, kind of key questions. We were expecting a lot of opinions, because obviously there's not just one Indigenous opinion or one Indigenous definition of any of these treaties or the topics that we're talking about here. But we have been really grateful for the feedback that we have gotten, and everyone has been very kind and generous in how they share their feedback, but also their excitement for this tool that I think is pretty unique and doesn't exist in another format really. So that's a bit about the treaty map, and hopefully you can take time to explore the site yourself. I'm going to pass it back over to Kelsey, and then we'll talk a bit about the process and then hopefully get to your questions.
Yeah. So here, I'll just read this first. So our goal with this project was to create an Indigenous-led authoritative treaty map that can be used as a reliable and accurate learning and teaching resource. This map answers critical questions on the rationale for treaties, addresses the complexities and nuances of treaties, and generally provides substance that goes beyond existing sites and tools. So basically, a very important aspect of the treaties too that I forgot to mention is their living relevance to us today. So because treaties are required for any non-Indigenous people to even have access to this land, once you're on treaty land, it's important to understand those obligations that you are a part of now. Because as soon as you're on this treaty land, you have entered into this agreement, and so understanding what those obligations are that you have. But it's really difficult right now for anybody to actually have a reliable understanding of what that is. And especially for Indigenous perspectives, because as Yumi mentioned, with all of the different perspectives that people hold, that's because these histories are held in ceremony, they're held in oral history, and it's really hard to just Google it and figure out an answer, especially when they're so big and those treaties were entered with the intention to protect so many future generations. It can't be whittled down to a simple sentence or a couple of simple sentences. It's a lot of responsibility to capture, but it's nonetheless very, very important to amplify. So that was basically our goal, was to try to track down all of these sources, have as many different Indigenous researchers as possible involved to be able to make some of those histories as accessible as possible, because they're so important and provide so much guidance for how we're intended to live our lives every day.
So this is just a slide that kind of outlines a bit more about our thought process in terms of creating the treaty map. So these questions are questions that we often ask whenever we start any project or even report, is kind of on the knowledge mobilization front. What are the simplest questions that we can ask in order to get to the heart of the research, and what are ways we can translate complex information into accessible, practical, and compelling content? And can we create a visual experience to go along with the research that helps bring it all to life? So as Kelsey mentioned, we commissioned the Indigenous artist, Michelle Sound, to create artwork for the treaty map. And it wasn't just any artwork. As you heard, the Royal Proclamation has a real significance. So we try to think of all these different kind of entryway points into highlighting the points that we are trying to make with the content that we're creating. We have a photo down here of some of our team, which includes our core team and a few members of our board and fellows. So as part of the treaty map, we had a treaty map advisory. So we have these amazing Indigenous folks from across the country who are really passionate about treaty, have tons of knowledge and tons of networks that they can tap into. So we asked them to review all the content multiple times. We also had some beta testers come in and support. We're probably light on the UX side, which probably for this room is the big no-no, but maybe we can talk more about that later. And then we worked with 3 guys from TO who actually had the technical practical skills to build the actual map. And that, as I mentioned earlier, was like a 2.5-year process that we undertook. And yeah, we hope to kind of continue developing the map. But this was our phase 1, and we're very happy to share it with you. So Kelsey's just going to wrap up with this one last slide, and then we'll stop talking.
Yeah, so what makes the Yellowhead Treaty Map unique? I don't know if anyone's ever used any other kind of tool, online tool to find the treaty territory that you're on. Right now, there exists like one major one that I believe it says what treaty you're on, and it says like whose territory you're on, and it's just very limited in comparison to this work. So as we talked about the challenge in understanding your obligations to treaty, but also understanding what not even about you, but what is, I guess, owed to Indigenous nations who entered that treaty, and what promises remain unfulfilled despite like Canada existing in such full force. So this treaty map is really unique in that when you are looking for the actual history, you can click on any treaty territory, and then it'll tell you the context of the treaty. So what was happening at the time that compelled this treaty to be entered, who was involved in the negotiations, like whose nations were there, what leaders were there in some cases, what treaty commissioners were there, what the negotiation process looked like, what the terms were, and then how has the treaty been implemented or not. And that has just like a much greater significance for someone who's actually looking to understand their treaty territory than just knowing the number of the treaty that you're on, like in a land acknowledgement where you say, like Dish with One Spoon, Treaty 13, but you don't know what that means. You don't know what the responsibilities are or who was involved or what was promised in that. So that's what makes it unique pretty shortly.
That's the end of our formal part of this presentation. We are happy to answer any questions you might have.